You're not part of it. My son said those 5 words with a smile on his face, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The dining room was warm with the smell of roasted chicken and fresh rolls. The chandelier above the table cast a soft golden glow over everything. It was one of those Sunday family dinners I had spent decades creating, the kind where everyone gathered around the same table and shared stories from the week. At 68 years old, I still believed those dinners meant something. I still believed family meant something. Vanessa laughed quietly at something on her phone. My granddaughter Chloe was scrolling through messages under the table. Ryan reached for another helping of mashed potatoes. Nobody looked surprised by what he had just said. That was the moment that hurt the most. Not the words themselves. Not even the smile. It was the silence that followed. The silence of people who had already known. Earlier that evening, I had overheard them talking in the kitchen. Not intentionally. I had simply gone to refill my glass of iced tea. I heard Vanessa mention airline tickets. Ryan mentioned a beach resort. Chloe asked whether they would have time to visit an aquarium she had seen online. Their voices were full of excitement. I smiled to myself at first. A family vacation sounded wonderful. As I returned to the table, I casually said, "Just tell me when the trip is. I'll make sure my schedule is clear." That was when Ryan looked directly at me and smiled. "You're not part of it." The words landed gently, almost politely. Somehow that made them worse. I waited for him to laugh and say he was joking. He didn't. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward her plate, but I noticed the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Chloe suddenly became very interested in her phone. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. My hands felt steady. Years teach you how to remain composed even when your heart is breaking. "Oh," I said quietly. "I see." Ryan shrugged. "It's just a small family trip." A small family trip. I almost asked what exactly he thought I was. But I stopped myself. The answer was already sitting in front of me. I looked around the table I had paid for 15 years ago when Ryan and Vanessa bought their first house. I looked at the dining room set I had helped choose. I looked at the family photographs hanging on the wall. Smiling faces. Birthday parties. Graduations. Christmas mornings. Memories I thought belonged to all of us. Yet somehow, I was sitting there like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Dinner continued after that. People talked. People laughed. Plates were cleared. Dessert was served. I said very little. Nobody seemed to notice. As I drove home later that night, the streetlights blurred softly through my windshield. The radio played an old song I used to love, but I turned it off. The silence felt more honest. Because for the first time, I found myself wondering a question I had never dared ask before. How long had my family been leaving me out before I finally noticed? I did not sleep much that night. The house felt unusually quiet when I walked through the front door, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to admit something I had been avoiding for years. I hung my coat in the hallway closet and stood there for a moment, staring at the empty living room. A lamp glowed softly beside my favorite chair. The same chair where I drank coffee every morning. The same chair where I sat every Christmas Eve waiting for family to arrive. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. Nothing in my home had changed, yet somehow everything felt different. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it into the kitchen. The clock above the stove read 10:17 p.m. I sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the warm mug. For years, I had told myself that families went through seasons. Sometimes children became busy. Sometimes life pulled people in different directions. Sometimes invitations were forgotten. Sometimes schedules did not align. That was what I always believed. But Ryan's words kept replaying in my mind. Not angry, not embarrassed, not apologetic, certain, comfortable, as though excluding me required no explanation at all. I looked out the window into the darkness of my backyard and found myself thinking about another evening almost 2 years earlier. Chloe had won an academic award at school. I remembered calling Ryan to ask what time the ceremony started. He told me not to worry because it was just a small event. A week later, I saw photographs online. Everyone had attended. Vanessa's parents were there. Her sister was there. Even neighbors were there. I had smiled when I saw the pictures and convinced myself there had been a misunderstanding. Then another memory surfaced. Last summer, the family spent a long weekend at a lake cabin. I learned about it from a photograph Chloe posted. Vanessa was smiling on a dock. Ryan was holding a fishing rod. The caption read, "Best family weekend ever." I remembered staring at that picture for nearly 5 minutes. At the time, I told myself they probably needed private family time. Tonight, those excuses suddenly sounded foolish. One memory after another drifted back to me. Birthday dinners scheduled without mentioning them to me. Holiday plans revealed after they had already happened. Small gatherings where everyone seemed surprised when I said I had not known about them. Individually, each incident appeared harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Around midnight, I stood and walked toward the hallway bookshelf. Dozens of framed photographs lined the shelves. Ryan at 10 years old holding his first baseball trophy. Ryan at 18 wearing his graduation gown. Ryan on his wedding day. I picked up the wedding photograph and studied it carefully. I remembered paying for the flowers when unexpected costs appeared. I remembered helping with the reception expenses because I wanted their day to be perfect. Back then, Vanessa hugged me and thanked me repeatedly. She called me family. The memory felt distant now. I returned the photograph to its place and noticed something else. Most of the newer pictures featured family gatherings I had never attended. Smiling faces, vacation snapshots, celebrations, entire chapters of their lives unfolding without me. I sat back down at the kitchen table and stared at the darkness outside. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being excluded. That question already had an answer. The question that mattered now was far more difficult. Why? The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The habit had stayed with me long after retirement. The house was still dark as I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker. Outside, a thin layer of fog hovered over the neighborhood lawns. Everything looked peaceful. For a few moments, I almost convinced myself the previous evening had been exaggerated in my mind. Then I remembered Ryan's expression. Calm, certain, unbothered. The feeling returned immediately. I carried my coffee to the dining table and opened my checkbook drawer. I had not planned to look through old records. My hand simply reached for the folder out of habit. Inside were years of receipts, notes, and documents. The ordinary paper trail of a mother's life. I flipped through them slowly. A check for Chloe's orthodontic treatment. Another for Ryan and Vanessa's roof repair after a storm. A transfer to help with unexpected medical bills. A contribution toward a family vacation they claimed they could not afford at the time. I remembered every one of those conversations. Ryan always sounded uncomfortable asking. Vanessa always sounded grateful afterward. At least, that was what I believed then. The stack of papers grew beside me. $20 here. $500 there. Several thousand on special occasions. None of it had ever bothered me. I loved my family. Helping them felt natural. Looking at the records now, however, I noticed something else. Most of those requests had come during moments when they needed something. New appliances, home repairs, school expenses, holiday costs. Yet very few documents reminded me of invitations. Very few reminded me of shared moments. The imbalance suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. Good morning. Thank you again for dinner yesterday. Everything was delicious. I stared at the message for several seconds. No mention of the trip. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just polite words carefully arranged like decorations on an empty shelf. I typed a short reply. You are welcome. Then I set the phone down. An hour later, I drove to the grocery store. The routine comforted me. Familiar aisles. Familiar faces. Familiar conversations. As I reached for a carton of eggs, I heard someone call my name. It was Margaret Collins. We had been friends for nearly 30 years. Her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a baseball cap, and she pushed a shopping cart filled with gardening supplies. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before she tilted her head and studied me more closely. You look tired, she said. I laughed softly. Do I? You do. There was no judgment in her voice. Only concern. We moved toward a quieter corner near the floral department. For reasons I could not fully explain, I told her everything. The dinner. The trip. Ryan's comment. The growing realization that I had been standing outside my own family for years without recognizing it. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she remained silent for a moment. Then she sighed. Eleanor, there is something I have been debating whether to tell you. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? She glanced around before lowering her voice. A few months ago, I ran into Vanessa and some friends at a restaurant downtown. I felt my pulse quicken. And Margaret hesitated. I heard her talking about family vacations. Someone asked whether you were joining them. She paused again. Vanessa laughed and said the trips were more enjoyable when you stayed home. The words settled between us like cold rain. Margaret looked genuinely sorry for repeating them. I stared at a display of yellow tulips nearby, unable to speak. Because for the first time, I was no longer dealing with suspicions. For the first time, I had proof that what happened at that dinner table had not been spontaneous. It had been planned. I drove home in silence after leaving the grocery store. The radio remained off. Even the usual sounds of traffic seemed distant. Margaret's words repeated themselves over and over in my mind. Not because they were shocking anymore, but because they explained so much. Suddenly, years of confusion began arranging themselves into a clear picture. Small moments I had dismissed as misunderstandings no longer looked innocent. They looked deliberate. When I pulled into my driveway, I stayed in the car for several minutes. The maple tree in my front yard swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Across the street, a young couple walked their dog. Life continued as normal. Yet I felt as though I had stepped into a completely different version of my own story. Inside the house, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. I opened my phone and began scrolling through old photographs. At first, I was simply looking. Then I started paying attention. There was a difference. Looking had allowed me to stay comfortable. Paying attention forced me to see what was really there. In photograph after photograph, I noticed the same pattern. Family events where I appeared only at the beginning. Gatherings where everyone else seemed to have inside jokes I did not understand. Vacations I had helped finance but never attended. Celebrations where I smiled for the camera before quietly disappearing from the rest of the day. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. I had spent years accepting scraps while convincing myself they were invitations. Around 3 o'clock, I found an old photo from Chloe's 12th birthday party. I remembered spending an entire weekend helping decorate the backyard. I baked cupcakes. I arranged tables. I even paid for the rental equipment when unexpected costs appeared. Yet when I looked closely at the photographs from later that evening, I realized something strange. Most of the family pictures had been taken after I left. At the time, Vanessa told me everyone was tired and the party was ending early. Apparently, it had not ended at all. I sat back in my chair and stared at the image. Not angry, not even surprised, just tired. Tired of making excuses for people who never seemed interested in making any for me. My eyes drifted toward the hallway cabinet where several framed family portraits stood. One picture caught my attention. It had been taken nearly 5 years earlier during Thanksgiving. Ryan stood beside Vanessa. Chloe stood in front of them. I stood at the edge of the frame. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Looking at it now, I wondered whether that position had been symbolic all along. Always present, never central. My phone vibrated suddenly. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful, normal, as though nothing had happened. "Hello, Ryan. Just checking in." I waited. He said nothing about the trip, nothing about dinner, nothing about excluding me. Instead, he talked about work, the weather, and a neighbor who was renovating his garage. The conversation felt strangely hollow. Near the end, he mentioned that they would be busy over the next couple of weeks. Busy. The word stood out. Busy enough for vacations. Busy enough for celebrations. Busy enough for everyone except me. When we finally hung up, I placed the phone face down on the table. Then I walked into my study and unlocked a small wooden cabinet that had belonged to my late husband. Inside were folders, records, and documents I had not reviewed in years. I had no specific reason for opening it that afternoon. At least that was what I told myself. But as I lifted the first folder into my hands, I sensed that the answers I was searching for might not be found in old photographs. They might be hidden somewhere much closer to the future. The wooden cabinet smelled faintly of cedar when I opened it. My husband had always been meticulous with paperwork. Every document had its place. Every folder was labeled in his careful handwriting. For years after he passed away, I rarely touched any of it. The cabinet felt less like storage and more like a conversation I was not ready to have. That afternoon, however, I pulled the folders out one by one and spread them across my desk. Insurance records, tax returns, property documents, investment statements, pieces of a life built slowly over 4 decades. Outside my study window, sunlight stretched across the backyard. Inside, I found myself looking at my future through sheets of paper. The first thing that surprised me was how much I had forgotten. After my husband died, I handled the practical responsibilities because I had to. But grief has a way of narrowing your focus. You complete tasks without truly seeing them. Now, years later, I was seeing everything clearly again. There were investment accounts that had quietly grown over time, a retirement fund that remained healthier than I remembered, a small trust my husband established long ago, a vacation property in South Carolina that had increased significantly in value. None of it made me wealthy beyond imagination, but it represented security, independence, options. I sat back and rubbed my temples. Suddenly, another realization surfaced. Ryan and Vanessa knew very little about any of this. Over the years, I had occasionally helped them financially, but I never discussed the larger picture. They knew I was comfortable. They did not know the details. For some reason, that thought lingered longer than the others. I continued reading until evening. One document led to another. Notes my husband had written in the margins. Letters from financial advisors. Plans we had made together when retirement still seemed far away. At one point, I found a yellow sticky note attached to a folder. In my husband's handwriting were 6 simple words. Always protect your peace first. I stared at the note for a long time. My husband had not been a dramatic man. He rarely offered advice unless it truly mattered. Seeing those words now felt strangely personal, as though he had anticipated a conversation we would never get to have. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with our longtime attorney, David Mercer. He had known our family for years and had handled various legal matters after my husband's passing. When I arrived at his office 2 days later, he greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room overlooking downtown. We exchanged pleasantries before he noticed the stack of folders I carried. "Looks like you have been doing some organizing," he said with a smile. "Something like that," I replied. For nearly an hour, we reviewed documents together. He explained updates. He answered questions. He pointed out details I had overlooked. The conversation remained practical until he asked a simple question. "Have you reviewed your estate plans recently?" I hesitated. "Not in several years." David nodded thoughtfully. "Life changes. Relationships change. Sometimes documents should change too." He said it casually, without pressure, yet the words settled heavily in my mind. Relationships change. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that sentence. Not with bitterness, not with anger, simply with clarity. For years, I had organized my future around people I assumed would always value my place in their lives. Now I was beginning to understand something important. Respect could not be purchased through generosity. Inclusion could not be earned through sacrifice. Love could not survive indefinitely on one person's effort alone. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset fade beyond the trees. My phone remained silent. No calls from Ryan. No messages from Vanessa. The family trip was getting closer. Somewhere, plans were being finalized. Reservations were being confirmed. Excitement was building. And for the first time, instead of wondering why I had been left behind, I found myself asking a very different question. What would happen when they realized I had finally stopped chasing a seat at their table? The family trip began the following Friday. I only knew that because Chloe accidentally mentioned the departure date during a brief phone call earlier that week. She was excited and distracted, talking about beaches, restaurants, and sightseeing plans. I listened patiently and asked a few questions. She answered without realizing she was revealing details nobody else had intended to share. When the call ended, I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and continued preparing dinner for one. The surprising thing was how little it hurt compared to before. A few weeks earlier, I would have spent the evening wondering why I was not included. Now I simply accepted the reality for what it was. Acceptance did not erase disappointment. It just removed the confusion. The following morning, I woke up early and drove to a local farmer's market. The weather was pleasant. Sunlight filled the streets. Families wandered between vendors carrying fresh produce and flowers. For the first time in years, I spent an entire day without adjusting my schedule around someone else's plans. There was an unexpected freedom in that. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan appeared. "We made it safely. The resort is beautiful." I smiled faintly. The message felt more like a notification than a conversation. I replied with a simple sentence wishing everyone a good time. Several hours passed before another message arrived. This one came from Vanessa. "Do you happen to remember the contact information for the travel insurance company you used last year?" I stared at the screen for a moment. It was an odd question. Then I remembered something. Years earlier, after a canceled flight disrupted one of their vacations, I had helped them navigate a complicated reimbursement process. Since then, they often called me whenever travel problems appeared. I sent the information and returned to my evening. The next day, another message arrived. Then another. Small issues seemed to be piling up. A reservation misunderstanding. Additional fees. Unexpected expenses. None of it sounded catastrophic. Just inconvenient. Yet I noticed something familiar. Whenever a problem surfaced, someone reached out to me. Not to include me. Not to spend time with me. To solve something. To provide information. To make things easier. By the fourth day, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Ryan called shortly after breakfast. His tone sounded unusually tense. He explained that certain excursion packages cost significantly more than expected. Then he casually mentioned that several extra charges had appeared throughout the trip. I listened quietly. Finally, he laughed and said, "You always know how to handle these things." The comment was intended as a compliment. Somehow it felt like something else. After we hung up, I sat on my porch and reflected on the conversation. For years, I had mistaken usefulness for closeness. Every time they needed advice, assistance, or support, I interpreted it as connection. Now I understood the difference. People can depend on you without truly valuing you. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating. Later that week, I met Margaret for lunch at a small cafe downtown. We sat beside a large front window overlooking the street. Halfway through the meal, she asked whether I had heard from the family. I nodded. Several times. "How is the vacation going?" she asked. I stirred my iced tea slowly. Apparently they are having a wonderful time. Whenever they are not dealing with problems. Margaret smiled knowingly. "And how are you doing?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was difficult, but because nobody else had asked it. I considered my answer carefully. Then I looked out the window at people passing by on the sidewalk and realized something surprising. For the first time in a very long time, I was beginning to feel less like a neglected guest in someone else's life, and more like the owner of my own. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the people who had spent years assuming I would always be there were about to learn that some doors remain open only because someone chooses to keep opening them. The trip ended on a Sunday afternoon. I knew because Chloe sent me a photograph from the airport while they waited for their flight home. She was standing beside a large window overlooking the runway, smiling brightly with a souvenir bag over one shoulder. I smiled when I saw the picture. Whatever frustrations existed between the adults, none of them were Chloe's fault. She was still young enough to speak honestly before learning how often adults hide behind convenience. Later that evening, Ryan called. His voice sounded tired. Travel always seemed to wear him out more than it should. We talked briefly about the flight, the weather, and how crowded the airport had been. Then there was a pause. A long one. The kind people leave when they want to say something, but have not decided how. "Mom," he finally said, "there is something I have been meaning to ask." I waited. "Have you been upset with us?" The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it arrived so late. I looked across my living room at the bookshelf filled with family photographs. For years, I would have rushed to reassure him. I would have protected his comfort before acknowledging my own feelings. This time, I did neither. "Why do you ask?" I said, calmly. Another pause followed. "You just seem different." Different. It was an interesting word. Not angry. Not distant. Not hurt. Different. As though my decision to stop chasing approval had somehow altered the natural order of things. "People change," I replied. Ryan sighed softly. "I guess they do." We ended the conversation a few minutes later. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a while. Something about the exchange stayed with me. Not because of what he said. Because of what he did not say. He never mentioned the dinner. He never mentioned excluding me. He never apologized. Instead, he noticed only that my behavior had changed. The following afternoon, another unexpected call arrived. This time it was Chloe. She sounded unusually serious. After a few minutes of casual conversation, she lowered her voice. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" "Of course." She hesitated. "You cannot tell anyone I told you." My stomach tightened slightly. "All right." What followed came out in small pieces. Chloe explained that before the trip, there had been discussions about whether I should be invited. According to her, Ryan initially thought I should come. Vanessa disagreed. She argued that the vacation would be easier without extra responsibilities. Easier. The word lingered in my mind. Chloe continued. Apparently the conversation happened more than once. Each time, Vanessa pushed back. Eventually, Ryan stopped arguing. He simply went along with it. I thanked Chloe for being honest. I reassured her she had done nothing wrong. After we ended the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. The information did not shock me. In truth, I had suspected something similar. What surprised me was how calm I felt hearing it confirmed. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden heartbreak, just clarity, the final missing piece settling into place. Vanessa had built the wall. Ryan had chosen not to climb over it. That distinction mattered. One created the problem. The other accepted it. Later that evening, I opened the folder from my attorney once again. Several documents rested neatly inside. Notes, updates, recommendations, possibilities. I read through them carefully as the sun disappeared beyond the trees outside my window. The future looked different than it had a month earlier. Not smaller, not sadder, simply different. For years, I had organized my life around maintaining relationships that no longer existed in the form I imagined. Now I was beginning to understand that peace sometimes arrives disguised as disappointment. And while Ryan and Vanessa were settling back into their routines, convinced life would continue exactly as before, they had no idea that I was quietly preparing to make a decision that would change all of our futures. 3 days later, I invited Ryan and Vanessa to dinner. The invitation itself seemed to surprise them. Ryan accepted almost immediately. Vanessa responded several hours later with a brief message confirming they would come. I spent the afternoon preparing the meal. Not because I was trying to impress anyone. Not because I hoped to repair what had been broken. I simply wanted one final evening of clarity. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same polished table. The same framed photographs. The same quiet warmth that had welcomed my family for years. Yet I felt different sitting there. Lighter somehow. Less anxious. Less concerned with how other people saw me. When the doorbell rang, I opened the door with a smile. Ryan stepped inside carrying a dessert from a local bakery. Vanessa followed behind him. Chloe arrived a few minutes later and immediately hugged me. We settled around the table. Conversation remained pleasant at first. School, work, traffic. The usual subjects families discuss when they are carefully avoiding more important ones. I listened politely and contributed when appropriate. Nobody mentioned the vacation. Nobody mentioned the dinner that had changed everything. Halfway through the meal, Ryan finally looked at me and frowned slightly. "Mom, you seem different lately." The same word again. Different. I set down my fork and smiled. "Perhaps I am." Vanessa shifted in her chair. "We were actually talking about that recently," she said. "You have been quieter." I nodded. "I have been thinking." Nobody spoke for a moment. The silence felt calm rather, then uncomfortable. Then Ryan leaned back in his chair. "Thinking about what?" I glanced around the table before answering. "About the future." That response immediately caught their attention. I could see it in their faces. Not alarm. Curiosity. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa. Small. Almost invisible. Yet impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. For years, I had overlooked those glances. Now I noticed all of them. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Chloe wandered toward the bookshelf while the rest of us sat down. The evening sunlight filtered through the windows, painting long shadows across the floor. I reached for a folder resting beside my chair. Ryan noticed it immediately. "What is that?" he asked. "Just some paperwork," I replied. Vanessa's eyes lingered on the folder a second longer than necessary. Again, a detail I might once have ignored. We talked for another 20 minutes before they eventually stood to leave. As Ryan hugged me goodbye, he hesitated. "Everything is okay, right?" I looked at him carefully. My son. The little boy I once drove to baseball practice. The young man I helped through college. The adult who had allowed someone else to decide whether I belonged in his life. "Everything is becoming clear," I said softly. He seemed uncertain how to respond. They left a few minutes later. The house grew quiet once again. I carried the folder back into my study and sat at my desk. Inside were the revised documents David and I had discussed. Updated plans. New instructions. Decisions made calmly and deliberately. Nothing had been finalized yet, but the direction was clear. For the first time in years, every choice reflected reality rather than obligation. My phone buzzed shortly before bedtime. A message from Ryan appeared. "Thanks again for dinner. It was good seeing you." I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone aside. Because what neither he nor Vanessa understood was that dinner had not been about reconnecting. It had been about observing. And after everything I had seen that evening, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The following week, I met David one final time. The morning air was crisp as I walked into his office carrying the same folder that had been sitting on my desk for days. There was no hesitation left, no uncertainty. The decisions inside those pages had taken shape slowly, built from months of observation and years of quiet disappointment. David reviewed each document carefully. He explained every detail, just as he always did. When he finally looked up and asked whether I was comfortable moving forward, I smiled and said yes. The answer felt surprisingly peaceful. By the time I returned home, a weight I had carried for years seemed lighter. Not gone entirely, just lighter. A few days later, I invited Ryan and Vanessa over once more. This time, I told them there was something important I wanted to discuss. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. Ryan looked curious. Vanessa looked cautious. Chloe came along as well, carrying a library book under one arm. We gathered in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the familiar photographs on the shelves. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I placed a folder on the coffee table. Ryan glanced at it immediately. "What is this?" he asked. I folded my hands calmly. "My future plans." Vanessa sat a little straighter. Ryan looked confused. I explained everything clearly and without emotion. I had updated my estate documents. I had reorganized several financial arrangements. I had established new charitable gifts. I had also created educational provisions that would directly benefit Chloe in the years ahead. Ryan listened quietly. Vanessa remained completely still. I continued speaking. For a long time, I made decisions based on assumptions. I assumed closeness would always exist because I wanted it to. I assumed effort would naturally be returned. I assumed family relationships could survive indefinitely without care. The room remained silent. I no longer make decisions based on assumptions. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, what is this really about?" I looked at him. Not angrily, not sadly, just honestly. "It is about accepting reality." He opened his mouth as if preparing an argument, then stopped. Because deep down, he already knew. I did not mention the vacation directly. I did not mention every forgotten invitation or every quiet exclusion. I did not need to. Those conversations belonged to the past. What mattered was the future. Chloe looked between all of us, sensing the seriousness of the moment without fully understanding it. I smiled at her. "None of this changes how much I love you." She smiled back. After another few minutes, the discussion ended. There were questions. There were surprised expressions. There were long pauses. But there was no dramatic confrontation. Only consequences arriving quietly after years of unnoticed choices. When they finally left, Ryan lingered near the doorway. "I never wanted things to become like this," he said softly. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Not cruelty, not hatred. Just years of small decisions that slowly pushed someone aside until exclusion felt normal. I nodded. Neither did I. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but the words never came. After the door closed behind them, I walked onto my back porch. The evening sky glowed orange and gold above the trees. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. Months earlier, I had been sitting at a dinner table asking for a place in plans that did not include me. Now I no longer needed an invitation. Because the greatest change was not in my documents, my finances, or my future arrangements. It was in me. I had finally stopped measuring my worth by how often someone saved me a seat. And once I did, I discovered something unexpected. The life waiting for me was larger than the table that had left me behind.